Hello, I'm Steve Buck, Chair of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Washington. The lecture you're about to see is part of our annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series. Professor Edwards was affiliated with the Department of Psychology for half a century until his death in 1994. He was an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer who introduced new statistical techniques that are credited with changing the way modern psychological research is conducted. Alan also permanently enhanced the intellectual climate of UW Psychology by endowing the Alan Edwards Lectureship, which since 1999 has brought an impressive list of renowned psychologists to the UW campus to interact with faculty and students. Now, the annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series presents the excitement of psychological research and its tangible benefits to both local and national audiences. The lecture you're about to watch is one of a pair given back-to-back that matched a UW Psychology faculty member with a visiting researcher to talk about a topic of great public and scientific interest.
Dr. John O'Donnell is in our Department of Psychology. He will be also talking about how individual behaviors become integrated into adaptive group behaviors. Let me just give you a little bit of background on Dr. O'Donnell. He received his bachelor's degree in biology from St. Joseph's University in 1986, and then received his master's and PhD degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison in entomology and zoology. He went on to UC Davis after that, where he was a postdoctoral fellow, and from there he came here to the University of Washington Psychology Department as an assistant professor in 1996. He is currently an associate professor in psychology. Now, he's had a very active career so far. He was director last year. He was program director at NSF in what's called the Behavioral Systems Cluster, meaning that he had very important influence in determining the direction of NSF funding of research into mechanisms of behavior. Currently, he leads an NSF research program studying the neural basis of the division of labor in societies. Again, very impressive work, and you'll be hearing about this shortly. Now, Dr. O'Donnell's work has also received a good amount of press coverage in addition to scientific coverage and publications. His work has been featured in local publications such as the Seattle Times, as well as the New York Times, the Discovery section of Science News, Fox News, ABC News, and Neuroscientist, National Geographic, and CBC Radio, and so on. And so tonight, again, we'll hear what this buzz, so to speak, is all about. Now, just so that you know, Dr. O'Donnell has yet another talent. He's also an accomplished and well-recognized instructor here at the university and has received a number of different recognitions for his teaching efforts. And so all around, he has been a great scholar and contributor to our department and also the University of Washington in general. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. O'Donnell so he could show us his latest and his greatest.
Thank you, Sheri. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to come and finally do an Edwards lecture, and thank all of you for sticking around for the second hour of a 2-hour talk series, a difficult but hopefully worthwhile task. So I'd like to welcome you to the Social Network Lounge. And I'm giving I realize looking over my slides here, I'm giving what is, for me, a really strange talk in that I'm actually... The photograph up here of paper wasps, which are very near and dear to my heart, is a little bit deceptive because I'm not sure that I'm actually going to show you any data that I've collected. In fact, you might get the impression from my talk that I am nothing but a theoretician. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable with that and disturbed by that, especially giving a public lecture that's full of math and theory and graphs of various kinds. But I've actually become very comfortable with it because I've realized that I have arrived at the ivory tower. So I'm going to be talking about networks. And networks are simply systems that are made up of components, relatively simple component parts that interact with each other. And we can think of a lot of different systems that are familiar to us and analyze them as networks. So some examples of network systems within bodies or within organisms include the genes in a genome. And this diagram here, the white background diagram that you see, is actually not representing genes, it's representing proteins, the products of genes, but this is a network diagram, and as you can see, one might say ridiculously or certainly intimidatingly complex one. This is called an interactome. So this is a diagram that tells us something about how the different proteins that are produced by a genome interact with each other. We can certainly think of neurons in a brain or in a central nervous system in terms of network, representing a network. We can also think of network systems among animals, among individuals. We can think of other species, the wolves in a pack, various kinds of social animals. We can think of networks of relationships in humans. So we can think of the friends at a school. And I was very excited when I found this photograph to illustrate this point. The kids around the maypole linked together by sort of a literal network. And then we can think of or model artificial systems as networks as well. So we can think of the computers in I couldn't come up with a better term, the computers in a network as a network. And I'm going to be presenting some models that I've developed to analyze how networks behave. And one of the things that I think is really exciting about these models, and one of the reasons that I'm actually not going to focus on my empirical studies, on my own data, is that I actually think that the models that I've developed in collaboration with my wife, Susie, can possibly be applied to a very wide array of systems, possibly to all the different classes of networks that I've just described to you. So I like to think that these are very general models, even though I developed them initially because of my interest in social insects. So talking about networks, I want to tell you a little bit about network terminology, how we think about networks, how we describe them. They're really quite simple. The idea is basically, again, we talked about it as an interactive system made up of component parts that are relatively simple. And we think of the individuals that make up the network, the individual units, as nodes. So some examples of nodes, kind of connecting back to the various kinds of systems that we think of or analyze in network ways. We can think of the insect workers in a colony as representing nodes. The people in a company could be nodes. Computers in a network, the individual neurons in a brain. And then the nodes are linked to each other somehow, and the ways that they're linked are through what we call edges. The edges represent the interactions between the nodes. It's the transfer of information or communication between the nodes. And examples of edges in real-life networks can be things like phone calls or conversations in a human network. We can think of aggressive or dominance interactions among animals in a society. Pheromones being given off by animals in a social system, in a social insect colony. We can think of the neurotransmitters being given off by neurons as they're interacting with each other as edges. Now we're going to depart from the world of concrete reality and move off into the world of graphical representation fantasy. So we often show networks using diagrams. Now, obviously, these are highly simplified, but we use these kinds of diagrams to describe and analyze networks and think about how they operate. And so imagine, if you will, a series of people on the board of a company or a bunch of wolves in a pack represented by these little dots. So the dots represent the individuals, the nodes in the network. And then we're going to represent the interactions between those individuals using lines. And an important part of thinking about and analyzing networks, how they operate, is to think about the transmission of information, to think about the edges, and think about communication. So we're going to start off with this one individual that I've highlighted here. When we talk about communication, we need to have a sender of information and a receiver of information. So let's imagine that this highlighted individual is our initial sender. That individual then communicates with receivers, and we can imagine that their behavior might be changed. Let's think of them as being somehow activated, and then those receivers can then in turn become senders and send on information to yet new sets of receivers and so on. So this is a way of modeling or representing the transmission of information among the nodes in a network or through the network. A lot of effort in studying networks has focused on describing network structure. And I'm actually interested myself in going beyond that, and I'm particularly interested in trying to understand and analyze how networks function, how they operate. And I'm going to focus in this talk on the flow of information through networks. I'm going to try to answer questions, or at least begin to answer questions, like how can information transfer itself vary among networks? Can we talk about the design of communication systems and vary features of the communication system itself and look at how that's going to affect outcomes or behavior at the network level? How might changing the information flow affect the behavioral output of the network? And in the end, I'm really interested in trying to understand how social communication, how this transmission of information in networks of animals might evolve by natural selection. And I'm particularly interested in trying to understand how communication in social groups might evolve by natural selection operating on the groups themselves rather than on the individuals that make up the groups. And in doing this, if we can understand something about how communication systems can evolve, or whether that's plausible, there might be some implications for the design of artificial networks as well. So let's look at some key features of communication that we might vary or alter or tweak and try to understand how they might be relevant to looking at the function or the behavior of the entire network. Well, one thing we might think about is, we talked about there being senders and receivers. What proportion of individuals in a group can send information? So we can think about, we can call this the amount of coverage. And this is an example of a relatively sparse coverage. So you can see that a relatively small number of individuals in this imaginary network are acting as senders. And in contrast, we might have extensive coverage where a large portion of the individuals in the group can act as senders. And you can see that you could imagine that this kind of communicative system might behave quite differently from this one. So coverage is one feature of the communication system that we might vary that could be relevant to understanding the behavior of the group as a whole. So just as an example of this, to kind of flesh this out a bit, you might think of a population of songbirds as a network. And I actually put this example in somewhat tongue-in-cheek because songbird research is very, very well represented here at the University of Washington. So it turns out that in a lot of songbirds, many of us are familiar with songbirds, we think of male songbirds as being the sex that does the singing, but it turns out that in a lot of species of songbirds, females are in fact capable of singing, but they do so relatively rarely. So if we think about sex differences in song production and we're modeling our population of songbirds as a network, we might think of the sexes having very different communicative networks. And so to follow up on this example or this notion of coverage, the females have a relatively sparse network. Relatively few of them are going to be acting as senders. The males are going to have a very extensive network. And when you get that kind of extensive network, you can get this kind of output. So I'm going to play you a recording, hopefully if I can get the cursor to come up, here it is, of a dawn chorus. And almost all of the sound that you're going to be hearing in this recording is going to be male birds singing right before the sun comes up in the morning. Let's consider some human examples. Consider the implications of changes in communication technology for gossip, for the spread of information by rumor. So we're going to step from the olden days to the very current. Going through changes in technology, means by which gossip-like information could be transmitted among a network of people, of interacting people. So we start off with word of mouth. Here we have a couple of neighbors chatting over the fence. We move on to the introduction of the telephone. Obviously, tremendous increase in the capacity to spread gossip, the rate of spreading gossip, the extent of spreading gossip, but not really perfect. You've got this problem, oh, hold on, I've got a call on the other line. There are limitations to the extent to which we can increase information, gossip transmission using the telephone. Now, of course, we've got texting going on. So this raises an important question that's going to be relevant to my model. The question is enhanced communication always good? And, of course, by asking a question like that, the implicit answer is perhaps no. So here we have the inevitable outcome of the new soon-to-be husband and wife texting their vows to each other. This example, as I was fishing for actually sex differences, male-female differences in human communicative interactions, I instead stumbled upon this, I think, absolutely fascinating phenomenon, which I was unaware of before. And again, this is enhanced communication always good? I'm not quite sure that it is. So apparently there's this new phenomenon called dipping, and it uses two new communicative technologies that have absolutely revolutionized how we can connect and communicate with each other. Rapidity, extent of coverage, and we can think of this information that's being spread here in a way as being sort of gossip-like. So what's apparently happening is teenagers, it's always those darn teenagers. Getting on Facebook, and what they're doing is they're using Google Earth or Google Maps to find pools in their neighborhoods and settling on a target pool, and then inviting friends to have a pool party between midnight and 3 in the morning at this pool, spreading that information using Facebook pages, suggesting to each other that they bring a bicycle so when the cops come you have a way to escape. And there was concern that these events might grow. It says down at the bottom, invitations were sent to more than 500 users on a Facebook site. This is a capacity for transmission, rapid, essentially instantaneous transmission of information. It's simply not available via old technology like telephones. Okay, so another way of designing or affecting the design of information flow, of communication in a network that we might think about that could affect group behavior is modularity. So we can think about subsets of individuals in the entire network, in the entire group, being more likely to interact with certain neighbors and less likely to interact with other neighbors. And so here in this diagram, we can easily identify these two more or less discrete groups of individuals. Information can be transmitted relatively easily and rapidly within each of these shaded regions and is less likely to be transmitted between them. And here's, I think, a really interesting potential real-life example of this phenomenon. And this is something that we've only understood very well quite recently, largely through the efforts of this man, Walter Schinkel, who's a colleague at Florida State University, who decided that it might be instructive to get a handle on the actual structure of ant nests. I mean, in most of our experience, we look at these complex societies, these amazing, hardworking animals, ants, to our weak ability to appreciate their architecture, basically what do you see, right? At best, there's a mound. Oftentimes, that's not even there, and there's a hole in the ground, and ants are going in and out of it. Well, what's going on down there? I mean, is it like you stuck a pencil in the ground? I mean, what? So Walter came up with, through a lot of trial and error, a slurry that he was able to pour down into nests, particularly in areas that had sandy soils, and then go through the laborious process. If you look at this example, imagine the work it took to dig down a couple of meters. Walter is a tall guy. Down into the soil and dig up all these pieces and then reconstruct this nest. Well, this is a cast of an actual harvester ant, Pagana myrmex nest, from the sandy soils in Florida near where Walter lives. So imagine a worker in this part of the nest, and what she might have to do if she were going to try to interact with or communicate with a worker far away in the nest. So, the information or the ant or, somehow the communication has to follow this tortuous path all the way up, the corkscrew-like staircase, across the top, down the other side, and then into this chamber, which is, by linear distance across the bottom, not that far away, but, as the ant walks, it's quite a ways. So we could imagine there's a lot of modularity here. Individuals that are in one part of the nest are much more likely to interact with their immediate spatial neighbors, much less likely to interact with those who are segregated. We can also think about the evenness of interaction probabilities. I like to think of this as a measure of the distribution of sender capabilities. So this is a relatively diffuse network. Here's one that is relatively concentrated. And when you've got this kind of a situation, you have these key individuals in an animal society, that kind of individual, or in a human organization, that kind of individual might be in an excellent position to play a governing or supervisory role. That's less likely to be the case when you've got this kind of communicative organization. We can also think about the information itself, not only the patterns of connection among the units in the network. We can think about the information itself, and one thing that could vary about that information is how long it lasts. How long does it persist? And that, I think, in some ways is a really interesting issue because there are at least two components to it. One is the question of physically the representation of the information. How long does it persist in the environment? So you could think of chemical signals. Some kinds of chemicals, say olive oil, if I were to pour that on the floor, that stain would still be here when we came back next year for the Alan Edwards series, right? I mean, that's a chemical that has very low volatility. It's not going to evaporate away. It's likely to stick around for a long time. Other kinds of chemicals, imagine if I spilled a little bit of ether. A few people in the front row would be really happy for a few minutes, but then it would dissipate and all the joy would go away. So, you can have the wide range of how long the information can persist physically in the environment, and potentially even independent of that, you've also got issues of how long the information is persisting in the brains, or the minds, if you will, of the receiver animals. How long are they remembering communication that they have experienced in the past? There's going to be some forgetting, there's going to be some decay of that memory over time, and that turns out, of course, also to be a highly relevant issue to this issue of duration. So just to use my little diagram-like models here, you've got the sender. She sends out information to a bunch of receivers and changes their behavior. She activates them. Over time, some of those signals will decay, and you can lose activity of some of those individuals. So before I move on to the model and talking about that kind of time course issue leads into this, I think, very nicely. I'm going to be focusing a lot on modulatory interactions among individuals. And I want to talk about what I mean by that and what kinds of behaviors, or maybe encourage you to think of some kinds of behaviors that might fit this category of interaction, this category of communication. One important feature of modulatory interactions is rather than a sender deterministically, automatically, and immediately leading to a change in the behavior of receiver, rather the sender is changing the probability of behavior on the part of a receiver. And so this means that the behavioral change in the receiver might be delayed. It might take place sometime after the interaction, or alternatively, the change in the receiver may occur only after repeated interactions. And when I was thinking about this, the example that came to mind most clearly for me as a parent of young children was trying to get the kids actually to go into bed. And this is basically is repeated every night of my life, right? So it's, some of you may have been wonderful, beautiful, perfect children, or have those kinds of children in your lives, or have heard of them living off in some far place. I'll tell you, they ain't hanging around the O'Donnell house in Shoreline I'm not really sure how many times I have to say, get into bed at time, but dozens to hundreds is a conservative. Okay, and interestingly, I'm pretty sure I haven't bothered to count, but my guess is it's not exactly the same number every night. Okay, so modulatory interactions, modulatory communication, we think of it as altering some kind of cognitive or physiological state in the receiver, and then changing the probability of behavior in that receiver. So these are the kinds of interactions that I'm going to be modeling. So examples of modulatory interactions. And again, this is part of why I got really excited about this model that I've developed, that I keep teasing you about, and is because I think it's potentially extremely general. It can apply to a lot of different kinds of networks, and there really are a lot of different kinds of behavior, actual communication and behavioral responses, I think, that can be captured by the model. So one, I think, fantastic example of modulatory interactions that impacts us probably way too much is advertising. How many of us have had the experience of either watching a sporting event on television or just by way of contrast sticking with mass media, but turning on Air America and hearing the same ad. I just heard that one 30 seconds ago. Why am I hearing it again? Why are you hearing it again? Because repetition works. Let me just say that again. Repetition works. So, okay, so advertising. Well, is it accidental? Is it because the ad execs at Air America or some sports channel are stupid, or they're unimaginative? No, quite the contrary, right? We know very well, there's very good research that shows that repetition of this message is much more likely to achieve the desired effect, which is, of course, I go out and buy that bottle of whatever that's going to make me fat. Okay, so here's another, I think, great example. Courtship and other negotiations. Yes, it is a negotiation in humans and other animals, right? For most of us, courtship is, except for those lucky rare instances, not a one-off deal, right? It takes some time to culture a relationship. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of back and forth. I think that's a great example, actually, of a modulatory interaction, in some cases occurring over very long periods of time. Rumors and gossip might be good examples of modulatory types of interactions or communication. I got interested in this because of some of my work on recruitment of workers to jobs in insect societies. In some cases, they fit this model of repeated, iterative, probabilistic interactions very, very well. So, having said all that, now we can move on to looking at the model that I developed. It's a simulation model of how altering the communication system itself in a network will affect the behavior or the outcome of the network. So in this model, there are senders and receivers of information. The receivers we're going to focus on very heavily. The receivers have what we call thresholds of response to a stimulus. And in the model, the threshold of response of the receiver is what is going to be dynamic. This is what's going to be changed by communication with the senders. So we're going to have or construct a group of units, a group of nodes, if you will, and set up a network. And the group is going to start off with a set level of overall stimulus. And you can think of this as a level of demand for some behavioral response. And then, in the model, the senders are going to interact randomly and probabilistically with the receivers. So this fits this notion of modulatory communication. And when interactions between senders and receivers occur, the interactions are going to lower the receiver's threshold of response to the stimulus. And so again, when communication occurs, it's going to change. You can think of this as changing the cognitive state in some way, or the physiological state of the receiver, and making it somewhat more likely that they're going to notice and respond to the stimulus that they're confronted with. And eventually, when their threshold of response is lowered enough, they're going to respond to the stimulus by changing their behavior. So you can imagine it, for example, that they weren't performing a certain job, and then they will start performing that job. And then when the demand exceeds a given receiver's threshold, that individual becomes activated. So we're going to be talking about activation of formerly non-active receivers, and we're going to be looking at the rate of that happening in the group. So the output of the model is simply going to be a tally of the number of activated individuals, and it runs in little time bouts. At the end of each time bout, we're going to count up the number of receivers that have been activated. And again, they get activated because they've been interacted with or they've received information from the senders. And this model is going to allow us to adjust the communication system and examine how changes in the structure of communication affect this dynamic process of activating some of the individuals in the network or changing their behavior. So what are some of the things that we can manipulate? What are some of the things that we can explore in this model? We can change features of the group design. We can change the size of the group, for example. We might change the number of active senders in the group. We can change behavior. We can change the probability, for example, that senders will interact with receivers. Remember that they don't interact with all receivers every time. There's a random probabilistic component to the interactions. And then we can model changing the cognitive state or the cognitive responses of the receivers. And one example of this that I'm going to actually show you results from, we can think about the process of forgetting about past interactions. And changing any of these features, it turns out, of the communication network can influence or affect how information is transferred within the group, and this will influence behavior at the group level, which is what we're going to see. So let's start off with one example. We're going to look at how changing the number of senders influences the rate of activating or changing the behavior of receivers. Now, it's at some level a no-brainer, as you might guess. If we keep all other things constant, which we will, group size, etc., you might guess, intuit, that having more senders is going to increase the rate of recruiting individuals or changing behavior, of transmitting information. And that's true. What's important about the model and interesting about the model is it helps us understand how changing the number of senders is going to affect the rate of recruitment of individuals. How is it going to influence the transmission of information in the group? And I think in some ways the answer to that question is not particularly intuitive. So let's start off with a group of 100 individuals, and in the conditions that I've set for this run of the model, only 5 of them are acting as senders. Well, what you can see here is it's flatlined, right? We get all the way out to 100 time steps, and not a single receiver has been turned on when 100 time steps have passed. So we'd have to let the model run even longer to start to see activation of individuals when there are only 5 senders. Well, what if we increase the number of senders to 10? Well, we get a little bit of an upward blip. You can see that there, by 100 time steps, a subset, a small subset of that group of 100 has been activated. If we increase it to 25, we get a much faster recruitment. You can see that more individuals have been turned on in fewer time steps, 50, and then when all of them are acting as senders, we get the logical maximum rate of recruitment. So this shape of the rate of turning on individuals, of changing behavior of receivers, turns out to be a universal feature of the model. It always follows this pattern, which is referred to as logistic growth. So we get a relatively slow but accelerating rate of increase over time in activation of individuals up to the point where we've activated half of the social group. So when 50% of them have been activated, we hit what's referred to as an inflection point. At this point, this curve starts to level off in the opposite direction, and it approaches a flat maximum up here, which is the point when all members of the society have been activated. So how do we capture the ways that recruitment of individuals, that activating individuals changes along with changes in this variable, the number of senders? Well, one way to do that might be to look at the amount of time it takes to get to that inflection point. So this is going to be our indicator of the rate of recruitment. So the time it takes to activate half the receivers, and we're going to plot that against the different variables. So here's another variable, the probability of interactions. What we can see here is if we have a very high probability of interactions, say 50% chance of interacting when a sender meets a receiver, it takes relatively little time to recruit half of the workers, whereas if there's a relatively low chance of interacting, you can see that it takes a lot of time. This bar is much higher. It takes a longer time to activate half of them. And this, again, this pattern of relationship between the things that we vary and the amount of time it takes to activate half the network was universal across all the variables that we examined in the model. It always took on this inverse first-order function. The real take-home message of this is at low values, so when we've got a low probability of interacting, for example, small changes in the probability of interacting have huge changes on the rate of activating receivers. So you get a lot of bang for your buck at low values. What this means is that the network system is going to be highly sensitive to small changes in this variable when the values are low. And just in contrast, way out here, when you've got a high probability of interacting, relatively large changes in the probability of interaction lead to very small changes in the rate of recruiting workers. So once you're out at this part of the curve, at this part of the relationship, there's not much more you can do to this system. You know, if a species, say, has a 40% chance of interacting or successfully communicating whenever a sender and a receiver meet, changing that to 50, 60, 70, 80 is not going to make much difference at all. Whereas, again, down here, if there's a relatively low chance of interacting, if somehow you change that just a little bit, you get a very, very different dynamic, a very different rate of transmission of information through the network. But depending on the needs of a network, and this is kind of getting back to that question of, is more technology or is better communication always good? It's not necessarily true that faster activation of receivers is better. Sometimes you don't want to overdo it. You want to modulate the rate of recruiting individuals or getting them to change jobs. And this model can help us predict ways to regulate the activation of receivers. And I just want to talk to you about a couple of those. So how do we put the brakes on? Well, one way you could possibly do this is if once an individual becomes activated, instead of acting as a positive sender, as when she interacts with colony mates or with group mates, instead of encouraging them to change their behavior in the desired direction, she actually discourages them. So she inhibits rather than encourages this change in behavior. And if we incorporate both excitation and inhibition in the model, we get this, interesting result. So if the strength or amount of inhibition equals the amount of excitation, here's our control situation where all the interactions are excitatory, all of them are lowering thresholds of response and encouraging individuals to change their behavior. Compared to that condition, this other dark line here with the upward pointing triangles shows that we've modulated at a new stable equilibrium, a new stable maximum value, the number of individuals that are activated over time. And then if we can play around with varying the relative strengths of excitation and inhibition and actually up and down regulate the rate of recruiting individuals. And we can also use this model, again, as I mentioned, to explore psychology, to explore the cognitive state of the receivers and think about how that might affect the behavior of the network. And this was the variation of the model that got me the most excited because this was modeling forgetting. So all I'm doing in this version of the model is saying, so remember that the interactions are occurring randomly and probabilistically, so there's a chance element to the interactions. If an individual was not interacted with during a particular time bout, rather than keeping her threshold of response constant it starts to decay. It starts to increase back towards its original value. And I set the limit such that it could only increase back to the original value that she was given. And so that's a way of modeling forgetting. So if a time bout goes by and you haven't been interacted with, you start to forget about or lose the effects of previous interactions. Well, if we incorporate that into the model, the results, I think, get absolutely fascinating, and I did not anticipate this when I developed this model. What you can see here is we've got error bars around our average values, and if we compare this graph to the other graphs that we've been looking at, for example, this one, the error bars are much, much wider. What this means is that the behavior of the network became extremely unpredictable and highly variable. And in fact, what's not captured by this diagram here is the fact that in some of these cases, even though there was a constant level of demand, a constant stimulus being placed for work or for change in behavior being placed on this group, in some cases, even though there were senders continually interacting and giving out information, recruiting individuals, all of the individuals became inactive. So no work was being done. And then eventually, oftentimes, the model network would recover and some would start being recruited back into it. But in some cases, we actually had the entire workforce drop out and stop performing work because they'd forgotten about previous interactions. To me, this was a really interesting and telling exercise because it suggests then that forgetting about past interactions is a really bad way to regulate a network. You can see this indication that we have modulated the rate of activation. We've modulated the rate of recruitment of new individuals, but we've done so in a highly unpredictable, highly variable way. And that's probably not a good feature for a real biological network. And that raises some interesting issues. I mean, one thing that it might suggest is that real networks are not likely to rely on forgetting as a way of modulating the rate of recruitment, the rate of activation of individuals. But it also raises the interesting specter that if forgetting is a universal feature of cognitive systems, if real biological brains have an inherent tendency to forget and you simply can't design around this, this may be a problem for network communication in biological systems that we simply can't escape. It may be a real constraint on the design of network communicative systems. And that's all completely rank speculation. We really don't know much about how forgetting operates in this context, but I think the model raises some really interesting questions. So I want to finish up with some take-home messages. Altering communication itself can have profound effects on the behavior of networks. This model that I've developed helps us predict what changes in communication will influence this dynamic behavior of the receivers, and it will also influence how changes in receiver behavior lead to or affect group behavior. The psychology of receivers, cognition, is centrally important to understanding network behavior. The study also raises some interesting remaining questions. One thing that the model that I developed hasn't really addressed is it's only looking at changes in a single behavior. It's not really exploring how changes in individuals' probability of performing one behavior trades off with or affects their probability of performing other behaviors. I think that I could extend the model pretty easily to start to simulate that, but haven't actually explored that yet. So how does communicating and activating individuals to perform one behavior influence their chances of performing other behaviors, and what are the implications of that for the group, for the network? In networks of social animals, how does communication evolve at the group level? If we think of a species having certain network characteristics, what are the biological characteristics of that species that might set limits on the structure of their communication system? And cognition, again, is I think, an absolutely central element to answering that question. And how do cognitive processes like forgetting limit or enable the transmission of information within networks? So that's all I had to say. I'll be happy to take your questions. Wait, excuse me. My phone's vibrating. I've been invited to a pool party in Phoenix. I'm sorry, but I have to go. But thank you for listening.
I don't know if you're going to be able to address this with your model, but I would be interested if you could even address it generally. About a year and a half ago, social networks really hit the press big when there was an analysis done from the Framingham study, longitudinal study, and they found that whether or not people gained weight was related to their social networks and who they knew, whether or not they even lived in Framingham anymore. And when you were presenting the stuff about the modulatory interactions, right now, we have a contracting economy. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, lots of people are trying to figure out where they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of interventions to affect obesity. And whether it's going to be in schools or worksite interventions or advertising or labeling of menus, might your model be able to help them make those kinds of decisions?
I think that it could. I mean, the thing about the model is it's extremely simple. It's a simulation model. It's individually based. So in other words, it's actually keeping track of imaginary individual units, animals, neurons, what have you, that make up the network. My guess would be that it would be possible to alter this rather simple model in a way that it could capture some of that kind of complexity. There might be a way to, vary the relative strengths of the probability of information coming from a certain source, for example, or the strength of the information coming from that source. It would depend on, like any model, it really depends very much on the assumptions that go into it. So you're assuming that behavior changes in this threshold-like way. You're assuming that there are iterative probabilistic interactions, et cetera. Now, there might be ways to violate or change some of those assumptions in the model as well. That's just how it operates right now. So to the extent that these different factors, or say these different sources of information in people's lives operate in those ways, then yes, I do think the model could make some predictions about that.
Cool. I look forward to seeing it.
There's one question up here.
My question is, so I've seen you model kind of information propagation in groups and influencing behavior. And if we take example of that same pool parties you were talking about, is there any researches? I'm sure there are, but can you tell us about opposite task, about information loss, about mispropagation? Is there any techniques or researches about intrusion, about I don't know, injecting information in this pool party conversation to distract and to destroy the stream of
That's
stuff?
a really interesting question. I actually think that this model could accommodate that very, very well. In fact, I don't think you'd have to change it very much at all. I mean, I hadn't really, well, let's see, in a way, there are probably other ways to do it, but this version of the model sort of gets at that kind of issue where you've got opposing excitation and inhibition and showing how that modulates the rate of change of behavior. I don't think that what the kind of injection of misinformation or confusion or noise, I wouldn't model it in exactly this way, but my guess is that the behavior would be somewhat similar to adding inhibition into the model. But it's a really interesting, it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Politician may like answer on this question.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one simple question for you. So in thinking about behaviors and regulation of behaviors generally across many different fields, there are many different fields that refer to context effects on behavior. We just heard of some of those in the previous talk. So I'm just trying to relate, when you talk about modulatory effects, is that Do you think of that as a mechanism for context effects, or is it a type, is it the same as the context effects and modulation of behavior as other people have described it?
I don't think so, but again, I bet you could incorporate context effects into this kind of model. I mean, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, basically what you would do is at some point as the network is changing, as individuals are being recruited, I think all you would have to do to simulate a context effect would be to change some of the parameters of the model, right? So, basically, I think the way you would capture a context effect, you would say, well, the context would somehow alter the probability of interacting or the strength of interactive effects. And so you could sort of have that occur at some point in the model and look at how it changed the dynamics. So I think that would get at it. The point of modulatory interactions, basically what inspired me to think about things in that particular way was actually some research that I did on paper wasps. So paper wasps of certain kinds live in complex societies, some of them do, that are a lot like honeybee societies. They're relatively large. They have a strong separation between the queens and the workers. There's a very strong division of labor in these colonies. Well, it turns out that the worker force engages in these interactions that look for all the world like aggression. Basically, they run around on the nest and bite each other. And what I found through a series of developmental studies and some experiments was strong evidence that the biting had a strong effect on performance of a particular task in the colony. So workers that were bitten were more likely to fly off the nest and forage. And the foragers are playing a very important role because they're the ones that are bringing in food, water, and building materials. So it looked like receiving biting was a very strong predictor and an inducer of foraging behavior. But the biting interactions were really complicated because oftentimes it would take a series of biting interactions. An individual was bitten repeatedly, separate bouts, again and again, sometimes over the course of days, before she would respond by going off and foraging. So there wasn't this clear, oh, you're bitten, you jump up and go off and forage. It was a more subtle type of communication. And then the thing that got me further interested in it was I initially assumed, seeing these interactions going on, that they were that they were true dominance interactions. It was simply social aggression. Individuals that were being bitten were, biting and being bitten were competing with each other for the ability to reproduce in the group. And I expected to see relationships between reproductive capacity, ovary development, for example, and giving and receiving biting. And those relationships are completely absent. So it didn't seem to have anything to do with reproductive competition. And that really made me scratch my head. What is going on here? Because it looks for all the world like aggressive interactions in other kinds of social animals. And the way that I ended up interpreting it was that it's kind of like the ghost of reproductive competition past, if you will. In ancestral species, biting like this, and in fact, inducing foraging behavior, is a form of direct reproductive competition. Individuals that are dominant bite and attack those that are more subordinate. The subordinate individuals are more likely to go out and perform these risky, expensive tasks. The biters, the dominant individuals, get to stay home, eat a lot, and lay all the eggs. It's a good deal for the biters. Bad deal for the recipients of biting. But that was not what was going on in these wasps, in these Polybia wasps. My best guess, my hypothesis is that the behavior is a holdover from reproductive competition in ancestral species, but it has lost its link to reproductive competition. It's now a form of communication. The outcome of the interaction is essentially the same. The individual that receives it is more likely to leave and go and forage. But it's no longer those workers competing directly with each other. It's a way of transmitting information in the colony. But it seemed to have this modulatory nature where you were changing the probability that the receiver would go off, or that the one who was bitten, the receiver of the biting, would go off and forage. But it wasn't an all or nothing response. So it was those kinds of observations got me thinking about and interested in modulatory types of interactions. But when I thought about it, I kind of stepped back. I realized that there are a lot of kinds of interactions. There are a lot of kinds of social interactions, for example, and even in humans, as I went over, that seem to fit that kind of notion of repeated probabilistic interactions.